The main objectives in feeding fully beaked flocks is to support good behavior. This can be achieved by managing the feeding system, providing adequate levels of fiber, optimizing feed physical quality, providing for the bird's nutritional needs, and doing this on a consistent basis. For the next few minutes, we're going to go into each of these areas in a little more detail. A well-managed feeding system and nutrition is not only going to support good performance, but also promote good behavior. It's important that birds have got access to feed throughout the day, from the time that the birds arrive on the laying farm through to about 22 weeks of age. From that age onwards, it's a good idea to allow the birds to consume all the feed from the feeding system during the morning period. This is going to encourage consumption of small particles of feed. And this is important because a lot of the small particles can contain components which can influence bird behavior. So it's good to condition birds at the beginning of lay to eat these smaller components of the feed. Feed distribution can also influence bird behavior. We need to ensure the feed is adequately distributed around the entire feeding system quickly, and that should avoid separation of components. If we have a scenario where feed is circulated around the feeding system for an extended period, there's a greater likelihood that we'll get separation of different components within the feed, and that can result in birds selecting out their preferred particle sizes, then resulting in uneven nutrient intake. A track speed of around about 20 meters per minute should distribute the feed efficiently. Checking the distribution of feed from the beginning to the end of the system is important regardless of the type of feeding system, but it's particularly important for some of the longer systems. So we need to check to make sure that at the end of the cycle that there is feed present within the track system or whatever other system is used. It's also a good idea to assess the particle size profile of the feed as it exits a hopper and then on its return. And this will check to make sure that there's not a significant difference in particle size profile of the feed as it's been circulated. Loading hoppers positioned halfway along the feeding system aids distribution of the feed. We need to stimulate feed consumption at the beginning of the laying period by running the system without adding additional feed. This has the effect of attracting the bird to the feeding system and also encouraging feed intake, which is important at the beginning of the laying period, where we really want to try to support early production. We need to check the presentation of feed within the feeding system by making sure there's an adequate depth of feed within the feeder. I don't tend to get overly concerned about spillage or wastage as long as it's not excessive. At the beginning of the laying period, I think it's more important that the birds find the feeding system attractive and that they are encouraged to consume the feed. We need to set the feed system at the right height to allow birds to consume the feed freely. All of these are quite obvious points. However, if we do encourage efficient feed intake, it's very likely that we're going to prevent any antisocial behavior. It's important that we provide adequate drinker and feeder space to prevent competition and stress. We give recommendations on the amount of feed space per bird and the numbers of birds per drinker. However, there may be situations where the numbers of birds that are stocked may be higher than what was planned or what the system is designed for. In this situation, there's going to be more competition for feeder and drinker space. Similarly, in alternative systems, there may be situations where birds will migrate from one pen to another. This will have the similar effect. We'll have a higher concentration of birds, a higher stocking density in one or more pens relative to others. And this is going to increase the amount of competition on feeder and drinker space and may result in stress. So it's very important that we keep to the stocking density that was intended, and we also try to prevent migration of birds from one pen to another. So we've talked about the feeding system and how best to manage the feeding system to promote good behavior. What are the main nutritional areas to consider? Well, we need to achieve a reasonable level of fiber in our diets. We need to optimize feed form. We need to fulfill the nutrient needs of the bird. And then we need to maintain consistency of nutrient supply to the bird. Fiber helps to develop the digestive system and gut capacity. It has a positive effect on satiety, gut function and condition by stimulating gizzard activity. Typical dietary fiber levels are between 3 to 4.5 to 5%, but we know that higher levels can increase feeding time, can reduce boredom, and that can then have a positive impact on decreasing feather pecking. The type of fiber is important. We're looking for non-viscous forming or insoluble fiber, and sources of this insoluble fiber can include wheat bran, oat hulls, sunflower hulls, canola meal, DDGS, and we know as well that some cellulosic additives can not only increase the dietary fiber level but can have a positive impact on antisocial behavior. Using a blend of fibers from a variety of different sources is generally a good idea, not just from a dietary point of view, but also from the point of view of the house environment. Often straw and alfalfa can be provided to the birds within the house. Also, birds out on range can consume quite a significant amount of grass, which can also contribute significantly to the bird's fiber intake. Feed particle size can also have an impact on bird behavior. This shows a layer feed which has been passed through a high-line sieve shaker. The majority of the particles are between 1 to 3 millimeters, with a smaller component less than 1 millimeter in size. These smaller components we really want to try to minimize, as they can have a negative impact on feed intake. Similarly, particles larger than 3 millimeters tend to be consumed too quickly by the bird. So we're really aiming for particles to fall between 1 to 3 millimeters. This is a particle size which the bird will find attractive and at the same time will keep it occupied feeding for longer than large particles. Feeding mash is generally preferred due to the longer feeding times relative to feeding pellets, which will reduce the bird's feeding time. From a behavioral point of view, this is not necessarily what we want. This is a very good example of an extremely fine mash, and birds that are presented this type of feed form are likely to be disinterested in the feed and find it unpalatable. And that being the case, the birds are likely to demonstrate explorative or boredom pecking. So it's a good idea that if your feed form looks like this, that you take a look at your feed processing or contact your feed supplier and see whether they can supply you with a coarser meal. This is the opposite extreme where we have many coarse feed particles within the feed, and that might result in feed selection by dominant birds, and this can result in aggressive competition and uneven nutrient intake. So we really want to try to avoid this situation as much as we can. This is an ideal situation where we have a small quantity of large particles which are evenly distributed through feed which is mostly 1 to 3 millimeters in particle size. Use a large particle size limestone or oyster shell in the layer diets. These large particles are not only going to support eggshell quality, but they're also going to provide a mechanical stimulus to the gizzard. And this is important because we know that larger particles of either oyster shell or limestone have this positive impact on bird behavior. Birds become a lot calmer when we use large particle size limestone. So really we're aiming for a minimum of about 60% of the total limestone added to the diets as in a coarse form between 2 to 4 millimeters. The remainder of the limestone can be added in a 0 to 2 millimeter particle size. So we've spoken about managing the feeding system and providing the optimal feed form to encourage the best behavior in the birds. but we also need to consider providing for the bird's nutritional needs. This is an example of a flock which is performing exceptionally well. Hen day production is shown in green and egg mass output in red. And we can see that this flock has not only peaked well, but it's also persisting extremely well. Hen day production is still above 90% at about 60 weeks of age, and egg mass output is above 60 grams per bird per day at around about a similar age. So with a flock such as this, which is performing very well, we need to make sure that we are providing for the bird's nutritional needs, not just at peak, but the whole way through the laying cycle. Ensure a consistent supply of key nutrients to the bird through lay. Transitioning to lower density feeds should be based on the existing feed intake and egg mass output rather than to an age. Plotted in blue here is the energy intake of the flock if it was fed a typical feeding program at breed standard feed intakes. By introducing the next diet in the program prematurely, we run the risk of not providing the bird with the energy it requires, especially if its egg mass output is remaining high and persisting at 60 grams or above. In this situation, we really do run the risk of not providing the bird the energy that it needs to maintain this persistent egg mass output. So the key point is not to lead production down. We really need to make sure that we are providing the bird the nutrients that it needs every day. This is the recommended energy intake for a highline brown bird at peak production. Energy intake should be between 1.32 to 1.38 megajoules per bird per day. This should meet the needs of the birds to support peak production. However, as we have seen, many flocks persist very well in egg production all the way through to late stages in lay. In this situation, the energy requirements by the flock are very likely to be similar to peak production. So it's important that energy density of the diets don't reduce substantially through the laying cycle. We need to achieve consistency in nutrient supply. We need to meet the daily nutrient requirements of the bird. On the right hand side, we can see the nutrient recommendations provided for each phase in lay. Amino acid requirement levels are provided in milligrams per bird per day, and these can be met if we know the feed intake of the flock. We can adjust the nutrient specification of the diet based on the requirement levels in that feed intake. As we progress through the feeding program, it's important that we don't make aggressive reductions in nutrient density, or more specifically amino acid concentration. Flocks which undergo inconsistencies in amino acid intake are more prone to antisocial behavior. So it's important that when we do make reductions in nutrient density, that these are quite subtle. So to summarize, nutrition for fully beaked flocks. A lot of what we discussed supports good behavior. So managing the feeding system, optimizing feed form, these are all areas that can have a direct influence on the bird's behavior. Nutritionally, we need to provide adequate levels of fiber and also provide for the bird's nutritional needs throughout all of the laying period. And we need to provide that consistently. Those flocks that experience inconsistencies in nutrient intake are more prone to developing issues. So it's very important that we do the basics, we do them very well, and we do it all the time. Thank you very much for listening.